Good morning, Beeville. This is Cindy Clark again with PAC-B TV, and we are here this morning with Karrie Lamacchia, who is the Director of Pupil and Personnel Services at Baker High School, or is it for the school district?
For the school district.
For the school district. Good morning, and thank you for coming. And we also have Joe DeBarbieri, who is the Deputy Superintendent of Schools, soon to be Superintendent as of July 1st. Thank you very much, Joe, for coming in this morning. I appreciate it.
Thank you. We're excited to be here.
Well, I'm glad. We were thinking about what would be a good thing to discuss in the district, and so we were talking about some of the mental health services that are provided for the children and probably staff as well, because they are affected by everything that goes on here as well too, and particularly in view of the two recent tragedies we've had in this district. First of all, I'd like to hear a little bit about your background and what you do and how you got here, and tell us a little about yourself, Karrie.
Okay, sure. So I'm a school psychologist was my by nature and by training. I was hired by the district and was at Van Buren Elementary as a school psychologist for 12 years. So most of my job has been spent in not just mental health, but also the realm of special education. And then I was the assistant director of special education and then became the director of pupil personnel services, mainly when we saw a need for sort of expanding those mental health services for students just before, during, and following the pandemic.
Okay. And Joe, I think most of us know your history here, but you want to give us a quick rundown?
Sure. I've been in the district since 2002. I started as a math teacher at Baker High School, worked my way through assistant principal at Baker, and then assistant superintendent for curriculum instruction, deputy superintendent, and have had stints as acting and interim superintendent over the last couple of years as well.
And soon to be superintendent, I will say again.
Thank you.
All right, well, let's get right to the meat of it here. Tell me how the district prioritizes its work in the area of mental illness. What do you do to handle it? I mean, what do you consider priorities for the students and staff? Now, do you also get involved with staff, or is it just students?
Yeah, we do. We pupil services, so our focus is our students and what our students need, but we do support staff the best that we can, mainly through professional development and referrals for self-care and reminding them to take care of themselves and offering referrals or outside services when they become available, but mainly supporting them through professional development and how to best help support students, really, because I think the crux of what they deal with is that they want to do what's best for their students, and they take home the weight of their students every day, and so really that's kind of the focus, and they're always asking for more services and programs and what can we do to help our students.
Okay.
So that's kind of the focus for that. But for students, we prioritize their needs based on, information from stakeholders and kind of what's feeling out the pulse of what's going on at the time and trying to be as preventative as possible with things that we know that students struggle with based on statistics and what's going on in the community. But we have, student-led groups. We have a district-level mental wellness group. And what we do is we meet regularly and we focus on topics that need to be prioritized based on need.
Now, how do you identify those in need?
So we have a student leadership group that lets us they're sort of the voice and they represent the students. Any topics that are coming up that are prevalent, like bullying or vaping or substance abuse, just things that we're seeing to kind of be an issue. Sometimes it's based on what students are reporting, sometimes phone calls from parents, just kind of gauging the needs of the community and the students.
Okay. Have you had any recent changes that have been implemented as a result of maybe not the overall, we've had tragedies in our area, but even in county-wide,
Sure.
And plus with the COVID, issues there, have you changed any directions of the programs that you have?
Yeah, one of the biggest things I think that we've done more recently following the pandemic based on, everybody knows, you hear it, you see it, that students are struggling, that mental health is on the rise, and that the pandemic really significantly impacted students and their mental health. And that there's not enough services to go around. And so our approach to that has sort of been threefold, which is just looking at the programs that we offer students. We've hired more counselors. Dr. DeBarbieri could speak to, the personnel side, but we've expanded our Liberty Resource Clinics. We're working with county initiatives and Onondaga County Mental Health to offer more supports within the school setting. Access workers, which are sort of an outreach program to act as a liaison between the school and families to assess their needs and help get their needs met. But also we implemented something called a behavior intervention monitoring and assessment system, which we had been doing at the elementary level, and there's a self version that we wanted our high schools or our secondary students 7 through 12 to take following the pandemic that fall. In fall of 2021, it assesses how students are feeling and gets to the root of because I think we've always known we tend to know our students that are having externalizing difficulties. Maybe they're struggling with something, they'll knock on the door, they'll tell you about it, or maybe they'll have a difficulty that's more apparent. It's our students with our internalizing difficulties that we felt like we needed to better be able to identify students that were struggling. And if they're not comfortable knocking on a counselor's door or coming to the office or reaching out to someone, how do we identify those students? So we did start using that assessment rating. We use it in the fall and the spring. And we've connected students through the use of that assessment to outside services, referrals. We're keeping an eye on them better at school, connecting them to emergency services if needed. So that's kind of been one of the bigger things that we've done since the pandemic. And then I think we've really worked on our social emotional learning, which is more of a preventative and proactive approach to helping students develop coping skills and foster that sense of community, fostering a connectedness, belonging at our secondary levels with training for teachers, and then also working with students to feel comfortable to talk about what they need.
Now, do you have programs that, say you have a child that somebody's identified this child, but they're not cooperative. They're shy, they don't want to admit it, or whatever the case might be. How do you reach out in a delicate way to help this individual, and what do you do?
Sure. So I think that is something that we recognize, that not all students are comfortable, and sometimes they identify, they don't want to talk to a support person at school, and that's where some of those connections, community connections with outside resources or mental health clinics are important. But also helping students understand that, who is the one person? Who are the people at school you can go to? Is it a teacher? Is it a coach? Is it, a principal? Is it a support person? The Promise Zone specialists that we have are more visible, and they act more as a mentor. So maybe that's a person. So just kind of trying to every angle, like who's the person you can go to and help students understand there has to be just like one person you can talk to. Is it someone at home, right? What's your support system at home? But at the very least, there's got to be somebody hopefully you can talk to at school. And then I think the other thing that we recognize is there is a very small percentage of students that, despite all of that, they may not still feel comfortable, right, going to an adult. And one of the first people they might go to is their friends. So we're really working with students as well to, help understand what to do if you feel like a friend is struggling. Where do you go help? Where do you get help? What do you do in the meantime? One of the things, through the leadership of Dr. DeBarbieri, we've been able to do is get in what's called a cohort program through BOCES, and we're working on bringing teen mental health first aid to our students. So this summer we'll be training key staff as turnkey trainers to implement a training program for all 10th through 12th graders next year, and training them and helping understand what are some risk factors, what do you do if your friends are struggling, what do you do if you're struggling, where do you get help, and how do you seek out support.
Now, what do you think as far as, you've never thought of this, but say percentages from several years ago to now, do you feel that there are students in need or crisis or whatever that are struggling?
Yes.
For whatever reason, COVID, whatever reason, do you feel the percentages have increased for those students in need and staff in need?
Yeah. Yes.
I'm sure there's probably not a number, but obviously, just from I'm not familiar with all of these programs, but just watching the news and talking to people, talking to parents, it seems like the problem is increasing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good to know that we have these programs in place. But like I say, with the children that won't necessarily reach out, those are the ones that I would be concerned about. Not just them, but some kids just don't want to. They just don't want to go there. Now, how about the SROs? Are they trained in identifying potential problems with kids too?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a collaborative relationship between our school resource officers and special patrol resource officers in our elementary schools with the administrative team, the social workers, the psychologists, the counselors that we have in those buildings. So they're working together. They meet regularly as almost like a leadership team to talk about where students are at, which students are struggling. And I think that team approach is really what is helpful at identifying some of the needs that Karrie mentioned. Going back to that data piece, that the BIMUS survey that we administer to our students has been helpful in getting us that recognition and identifying students. And I know Karrie, she has all the historical data on that from when we first started out to where we are now. I mean,
Yep.
You can speak to whether there's that increase or not. I think just the awareness of what we see, what we hear in the news, what we see in our community. It's more prevalent that we know. So I don't know if the numbers have drastically changed. I've heard more about staff members being more open with their own mental health and well-being concerns and issues, and so we've had to navigate that and help them, because if we're expecting them to be on, their A game every single day and they're struggling themselves
Mm-hmm.
with whatever it is, we need to make sure that we're giving them the support that they need so that we can ensure that they're doing what they can for our students every single day. So I think, I have heard in conversations with, colleagues that there is an increase from the staff end, but certainly Karrie can talk a little bit more about what we've seen over time with the student end.
Yeah, so typically what we'll see when our students are younger is they externalize problems, or we know who those students are. We can identify them based on maybe behavioral difficulties that are apparent. And so the teacher fills out that rating scale, and we're able to do some tier 1 programming or some program initiatives that are school-wide to support students. What we have found since we started doing the self-rating with students is that once they get older, they learn to cope a little bit better and hide those feelings, and so maybe they're internalizing more, right? So they're struggling and they're not maybe necessarily talking about it as much, or they're struggling getting their needs met in some ways, specifically through adolescence, which is a really tough time. When we first started the BIMUS, our results really aligned with CDC statistics, which show that I think was about 17 to 20% of students are at risk for suicide or self-harm. And we found that, and when we did that first assessment, fall of 2021, it was about 19-20% of our students rated a self-harm item, saying that they were at risk. It ended up being about 380 students that we triaged for emergency support services, and we had a number of students that were referred for emergency services. And then the value of that was that we identified students we didn't know were struggling, and 2, we connected them with services. We expanded our mental health clinics, and fast forward to just this past fall, we're at about 12% of our students that are at risk. So we're low. So in the meantime, the CDC statistics have gone up, and so I do think that there are probably still some students who are not identifying, that maybe our students are catching on, and we meet with our students regularly, and they'll say, we don't want to complete that item, and we're respectful of that, and that's okay if you don't want to, but there are still students that are filling that out accurately and getting the services they need. So I think that is one of the pieces that we're trying to figure out is if a student's not comfortable completing that, and if a student isn't comfortable knocking on someone's door or going to a parent, how do we get them the help that they need? And so that's why, fast forward now, we're at this place where we really want to train and empower our students.
Oh, that's a good
each other.
idea. That's an excellent idea. What's been the primary focus in the area of health and safety within the district? What would that be? Your primary focus?
So I would say, one of the things that when we look at health and safety, a lot of this work has been generated out of the Mental Wellness Committee. So their focus specifically, that stakeholder group that's helping us prioritize this work, has focused mainly on emergency response teams. So within each building, we have and then we have a medical emergency response team, so we call it the MERT team. And so they've gone through extensive training. We have a supervisor of school nursing that has helped facilitate that. So within each building, there's these teams of educators and staff members that are available to help in the need of a crisis. So we're able to pull those individuals for it can be a medical emergency, it can be a physical emergency. And then in addition to that, a lot of our school counselors, social workers, psychologists, through Karrie's leadership, have gone through that crisis training. And, given, what we've dealt with these last 2 months, it's been important that we've had that training to work successfully, hopefully, with our students. So that's been the priority from the safety end of things. I mean, obviously we work with our SROs and maintain the physical safety of our buildings through single points of entry, security cameras. We're currently working through a Smart Schools bond funding application that was presented actually at our last Board of Education meeting. There's a public comment period currently for 30 days, and on April 24th we'll hold a public hearing. That specific funding is going to be utilized based on the recommendation of a stakeholder committee to add additional security cameras throughout our buildings and to replace older units, bullet-resistant film that we place on our windows to ground level floors to make sure that God forbid there was any type of major incident like we've seen on
Just
TV
one that just
recently
happened in Tennessee.
Yeah, that we
Absolutely.
have those safety features in place within our buildings. We've done a lot of work over the last 5, 6, 7 years, and the newest piece that our community is actually families, stakeholders have said that they would like to see us implement is weapons detection systems. So similar to what you would see at an airport, when anybody walks into our building, they're going through
It's
some
like a
type
metal
of
detector.
metal detector.
Magnum, whatever
Yep.
it is, whatever they call it.
Yeah. So and I was surprised, quite honestly, but I think just given the nature of the world that we live in, I mean, it's becoming more and more standard
Necessary.
practice
Yeah,
to
it is.
see that. I mean, who knows? At some point, we're likely to see that at Destiny USA. But we did a thought exchange for all of our community members. Mostly parents completed the survey, and we asked them those specific questions. What would you prioritize? And it was something to the effect of 62% wanted the additional cameras, and then it was like 58% said they wanted the weapons detection system. So to me, that speaks that times have changed, and so we are in the process of testing and piloting some of those devices in a few of our buildings, and then the intent is to spend the $980-ish thousand that we have left in Smart Schools funding to purchase those types of items for our students.
Now, would that be at all the schools?
That would be
Every
the
school?
intent. Yep. At some
Okay.
point, we would prioritize obviously based on need. Likely the secondary buildings would get some of those devices first.
The areas where you have the most issues.
Mhm.
Sadly, there are schools that have higher rates of this,
Mhm.
of potential problems
Mhm.
or problems.
Yeah.
I know. Now, do you have SROs in all the schools?
All of the schools.
Okay,
yeah.
good. That's good.
Yeah.
That's
So
good.
the school resource officers, the full-time officers, are in the secondary buildings, and then the retired special patrol officers who still have the same jurisdiction and responsibilities as any of the other, full-fledged non-retired officers.
Right.
They're in our elementary schools.
Okay. I'm glad. I'm thinking back to when I was in school, because I graduated from here. Our biggest concern was if we were, what we had to wear to work to school that day, if we were gonna get asked to go to the ball or the prom or whatever the case might be, or if so-and-so was gonna talk to you and smile at you or whatever. And I'm looking at the changes because I grew up in a stage of innocence. Truly I did.
Yep.
You could go on the back of a pickup truck, ride in the back with your feet dangling down. Of course, in the middle of the village, we had a drinking fountain. Just a drinking fountain that anybody could come and drink. Dogs would drink out of it. But that's how I look, and I've watched how things have changed. And that's one of my big concerns with a lot of these, with kids, everybody, is the loss of innocence. Because when I was that age, the age of a lot of these students that are having these issues, that was never a concern. There was some bullying going on, but you know how we handled it? Well, I probably won't even tell you how I handled it because I don't want to give anybody any ideas, but we didn't handle it like it's handled today.
Yeah.
It worked for the most part, but I look at the difference, and like I say, I cry thinking of the loss of innocence, that these kids just can't be kids and enjoy and just be concerned about if you want to go to the movie, do you think he'll talk to me? How does my hair look? It's so much deeper today. There's so much more that these kids have to deal with, and it's so sad that we have to have these expanded mental health programs. I'm very grateful that we do, and I'm sure that they're working, but it's very sad that it has to be there.
Yeah. And I would just add, I think, for us, we're thankful that we have a very supportive school community because we've been able to add the SROs from the physical safety end of the spectrum, but then also the additional counselors, the social workers. Going back 5, 6, 7 years, we had social workers in the elementary schools, we had guidance counselors or school counselors at the secondary schools. Now we have both in all of our buildings, and I think that's important because they're building those connections with students and they're able to support them. So we've really taken, as Karrie mentioned, that multi-pronged approach to how we're addressing student needs. We've got the physical end of it, and we've got the social emotional end with those key personnel that are helping to drive some of our training and our dialogue. And that's huge.
Yes, it is. It is huge to know that that you're up on it. You're on it. Like I say, I'm totally ignorant about all of this because that was never an issue when I was in school. But to see now that how times have progressed, and I give you a lot of credit for how you've handled all of our situations going way back when, to keep the district moving forward in a positive direction, and having people like you, direct these programs within our district that we sadly all need. But thank you for that. Now let's go on to another area. What about substance abuse? How are you dealing with that?
Yeah. It sort of cycles, right? So prior to the pandemic, we had done a lot of work on, use of mostly alcohol. Like that was the substance we were seeing mainly in our students, like if they were struggling with something. So we've used the SROs to do trainings. We've used Prevention Network. I can remember right before the pandemic, we had Prevention Network come in, and for our support staff, we did, probably going to screw up the name, but it's called Hidden Mischief or Hidden Room. Essentially, they set up a fake bedroom, and we had our support staff walk through because we wanted to introduce it to them first. And what they do is they set up a mock bedroom, and you walk through, and you're supposed to be looking for things you might find in your child's bedroom if they were using substances. And then they take you through after and show you all of the things that you might have missed.
Ooh.
So it's very eye-opening. That was a program we brought to them because our plan was that spring to do something for our parents in the community, because everything we do for our staff and our students, we then also try to do some sort of community event to make sure we're being transparent with parents, that they understand what we're seeing, and that we're also facilitating that communication with them because we know it takes a village. And we shut down. So we haven't done that, but it's still on the radar.
It's still coming.
But what we are seeing post-pandemic, I think the biggest thing that we're seeing, and I can say this mostly through referrals and what we're seeing with our students that are struggling, is now that marijuana has been legalized in some places, there's the presence of THC in vapes. So vaping was a problem that we were struggling with prior to the pandemic and just following the pandemic. And what we're finding now is that a lot of those vapes that students are being caught with are testing positive for THC. So that is, and that's something that I think, back to going off of what you said, not something we struggled with when we were children. Vapes weren't around.
No.
And, if it was tobacco, it was cigarettes, and you could smell it. If a student had one, it was easy to identify. So that is definitely something that we're trying to educate ourselves on and understand, our support staff and how to help students. The high school's really done a nice job with addressing that. They have a vape educate program that if students are caught, there's obviously the code of conduct and those pieces that play into it, but there's also the education piece. Do you know what this is and how it could harm you? And really trying to support students with understanding the risks involved in substances.
Now, do you have actual meetings in school or in the auditorium to discuss these things, or how does the information get to the staff and the students as far as that goes?
Yeah.
I mean, on a broad spectrum, is that what you do, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
we do student assemblies, we do staff faculty meetings. Certainly there's dialogue about more, given the uptick that we've seen, specifically with vaping. One of the things that we're looking at, many of the community members probably don't realize that we the board just authorized a resolution at our last meeting. We're part of a lawsuit. Many school districts across the country were a part of a lawsuit. We were asked to join it against the vape manufacturers. So we are going to be a part of a settlement, and we accepted at our last board meeting the settlement agreement for at least one of the vape companies. We're going to be looking to receive approximately $87,000 for being a part of this process. And our intent right now is to take that funding and utilize it back to address vaping within our school community. So whether there's additional presentations and dialogue with students, or even the vape sensors that some schools are looking at placing within their restrooms and in other locations, so that if a student, because as Karrie mentioned, I mean, these you can't smell this.
No, but you can always smell the cigarette.
Right.
You'd have
Well,
some,
right.
a teacher walk by a restroom, you could see them looking up, and they go racing in, and of course they go down to the principal's office because
easy
it
to
was very
hide,
obvious.
yeah.
Oh,
So we
dear.
figure one way to use that money that we were getting from this suit was to put back in toward addressing specifically vaping. I mean, to me, it seems fitting,
Yeah.
right, that we're
Right.
using funding that way as opposed to some other
Now, what do
way.
you do with that? I mean, how do you've addressed in many ways the dangers. So how would you use that money to further make people
Educate.
aware, educate, whatever the
I
case?
mean, there's lots of presenters that are out
Yeah.
there that can connect and relate with students. I think part of it ties back into the overall student first aid training that we're looking to
Yes.
do from the mental health end. I mean, all of it connects, right?
Yeah.
So if they're engaging in those conversations with each other, with experts, with our staff, hopefully it's making a difference. And so I see it as, again, the dialogue. I mean, if students know that we know that that this is important to us because we care about them, I think it makes a difference. So it's really about bringing all of that together under that social and emotional learning lens, which our teachers are trying to do on a regular basis in the classroom.
Yeah.
Every lesson's connected in some way.
The state recommends mental wellness and social emotional learning standards that we did a crosswalk with, and we looked at all of our content area classes and how are all of these areas hit through different courses, content, and then what's left, right? And then some of those things are then met through phys ed or even health classes. So we talk about substance abuse in different units, and then we sort of prioritized what was left after that. Like, what are some things that kids are struggling with that we're not hitting in these other areas? And we really prioritized things like, tolerance, social media, acceptance, kindness. All of those things have sort of been a focus and a goal of raising or increasing the resiliency of our students, because like you said, these are kids that are struggling with things we didn't struggle with, and so how do we help arm them with the skills to
Handle it.
cope with something as adults we're struggling with, or the world is struggling with? Like, how do we give them those skills to be resilient, but also at the same time simultaneously work with our stakeholders, all three groups, the parents, community, students, and staff, to better understand what our students are struggling with, educate, and foster that sense of community and belonging, so that we all feel connected and are kind to each other in a world that isn't always kind.
You're absolutely correct. Now, let me ask you this. Are the parents, you've noticed the parents being engaged or not, or too busy, or what's your take on how the parents are engaged or get involved or stay involved?
I'm smiling because I'm a parent, but I also am a staff member at school, so I guess I could speak to both sides of that. It's hard. I mean, it's, I think even when we schedule an event, it's finding sometimes the auditorium, or if we want to use the fields or the turf, there's a million things going on all the time. So we don't want to give one more thing to a parent, and I know I've attended some of these, we've done things on social media, and I leave maybe sometimes stressed as a parent from those things, because even though they're informative and they're helpful, sometimes I'm like, oh, I haven't been doing this right as a parent, and how do I change sort of that, if it's my child's on an iPad and that's a habit, and how do I change that? So I think it's a lot. Like, it's not just about this one-time presentation, but how do we foster that engagement all of the time and support them? And so we haven't found that attendance at our events have been what we wanted. They aren't very well attended, and then, I think sometimes it's just one more thing parents feel like they have to do, and that's hard because we don't want to do that. So I know that Dr. DeBarbieri has been doing some of these thought exchanges, and that was something you had mentioned, and I really am hopeful. I think that might be a better way to get some more involvement and engagement from our parents. We did do some remote series with IndieFlix. We did a social media, one on bullying and one on stress and anxiety. Because of the pandemic, we couldn't open up, and those were better attended than our in-person events have ever been. So I think that was pretty telling.
Yeah. And the thought exchange really is designed to try to get feedback from our families. So if we know that there's an area that they're struggling, we have the ability to then prioritize, because, sending out, they're quick, and others, what's unique about the thought exchange that we've been utilizing is that you could write a comment, and then it allows others to have to rate that comment. And so we get, on a Likert scale, we get a real good sense from our school community what they feel needs to be prioritized. And again, we want that feedback. We want to do better. We want to create these events and these opportunities for parents to walk away with, what they need, that learning that's going to help them help us with their students. And so I think, again, it's new. Hopefully, it's well received as we continue to unveil these. We're currently utilizing them for our strategic plan process that we're going through. And what I've found through that is that the community is prioritizing social emotional learning and the mental well-being of our students. And so because of that priority from our stakeholders, it's forcing is a tough word. It's requiring us to do what we know is right and to prioritize that work within our schools. Mm-hmm. And so when we have that connection, we have that, our strategic goal is that we're going to continue to support those efforts. It's being reinforced by our stakeholders.
Yeah.
Okay, now what would you say the district's primary focus is in the area of suicide awareness and prevention? I know it's a sensitive subject, but it's very important.
Yeah, and I think it's something that our committee has discussed and talked about since it started back in 2016. We know that there are certain things that we have to do when responding to a crisis, but what we really, our focus is to be raise awareness, destigmatize, and be preventative. And so that's where our efforts really go toward. And just similar to all the things we've talked about, we're doing presentations, and when we do presentations, we have presenters come talk. Sometimes that's helpful because, you know, they have their own story that people can relate to. And we do that for staff, students, and, you know, the community for parents. We also like to, typically when we do that, provide a place for students to process that then, before and after, right? So we have this presentation and this is the topic. This is what we want to talk about. We added the BIMUS to try to be able to better identify students that are struggling. The mental health first aid program is really a focus going forward. We trained some staff 2 or 3 years ago. We have some turnkey trainers in the adult version of mental health first aid. So you're essentially seen as a first responder for someone struggling with an acute mental health crisis. So in the moment you're struggling, what do I do? So whether you're a community member, you know, a parent of a neighbor, or whoever it might be, if you see someone struggling and you think they're at risk, what do you do? And so we offered that to our staff. We also offered it to our parents. So that was one of the parent series that we did.
What's your response with these things, with the parents? I mean, going back to that, do you feel that you are getting the attention, the cooperation, the interest from the parents on programs and issues, working together with the district?
Yes, I do. I think
Okay.
everyone's just doing the best they can. You know, the mental health first aid it's a time intensive program, so we got a huge response as far as families that really were interested and wanted to attend, and maybe couldn't come but said, will you do this again later? So yes, I do think that families do want to work with us and they want this information, certainly. You know, one of the things that comes up a lot is that, you know, students and parents don't always know what to do. They'll say, you know, like, if you knew someone was struggling, do I call 911?
Right,
People are
right.
afraid. That's a scary thing. And students are sometimes afraid, well, my friend might be mad at me, or if they have a substance use issue and they know that they're vaping, or maybe even sometimes my friend made a threat, or maybe said they might have a weapon. What do you do? That it's so important to call 911, to get someone involved, that in that moment, and how do you identify this is an immediate risk versus this is something I can talk to my mom about later, or something I can talk to my counselor about? Really, that's the place I think where we're at right now with the focus is really how to empower our students and what to do in those moments.
Okay. Now, what, in your opinion, as a professional, what do you think is one of the major causes of the suicides today? Not just in our area, but nationwide.
Oh gosh.
I mean, is there a singular cause
no.
here, or?
I think we know students that are at risk, right? So we know students that are at risk for various reasons. You know, it could be trauma. It could be their own mental health. You know, maybe they have a diagnosis. Maybe they were bullied. You know, there are certain risk factors that contribute to an increased risk, right? There's this intersectionality, right? Like maybe I'm a student who we do a lot of work with trauma informed, so adverse childhood experiences. So maybe I'm a student who has trauma. My parents are divorced, and now I'm struggling with gender identity issues. So now I've got maybe 4 or 5 ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, or risk factors. Those things all magnify that potential or that increased risk. But we have students that don't have any of those risk factors that have struggled with suicide thoughts. So it's certainly there can be an increased risk in students that are more at risk, but all of our students are essentially at risk. It's something that kids struggle with, or can struggle with, and we just need to be aware of that. And we need to do our best to be preventative and keep a close eye on our students that might be more at risk because they have these other risk factors. You know, I think the other thing that comes into play with this particular age group is that, you know, there's a lot of science out there on the brain, and that their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed, and so they don't have the ability, you know, certainly adults struggle with suicidal thoughts as well, but they don't have the ability to know that something's going to get better, or that this moment in time that feels really bad is, I might feel different tomorrow, right? That they don't have the ability to cope in the same sense that we do as adults. So even sometimes giving them those skills is is hard because their brains aren't fully developed enough to know this could get better, or to be able to plan that future, go home, to a child, or, some of those things that as adults we're better able to do. So there's that piece.
Well, I have to say that, I am amazed. I was totally ignorant about what this district offers, and I'm amazed that these services are in place, and of course you're just gonna have to increase on these services from what
Yes.
I'm understanding here. But it's good to know that you were on it, you were aware of it, and you're making plans to do whatever you have to do to make sure that all these programs, additional staff or whatever to handle this type of situation. I'm very comforted to know this in my community, because we are a wonderful community here, and it does take a village. And it's sad to see, I'm very sad to see children struggling. I'm sure as you are too. And because I look at the struggles I had, well, of course, at the time they were monumental, but in retrospect and hindsight, they were nothing.
Right.
But as you
But
say,
at the time,
the process to be able to cope and say, well, this is like today. You say, well, I'm not going to sweat the small stuff. But you didn't have that ability back then to do that. But I'm so comforted to know, and as I'm sure the community is comforted to know, all the programs we have in place. And if people have any questions, please contact us at info@pacbtv.org. If you have questions, suggestions, for Dr. DeBarbieri and Karrie, please send them in to us, and we will forward them on.
Perfect.
And they will do the best they can to answer any questions that you've had, because these are very important issues. We are a community. We all have to work together, and it's a great thing to know that we have people in place here in our community that recognize that, are very aware of it, and are doing something about it to help not only the children, but the staff, each other, and the rest of the community, because it affects everybody.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for
Thank you.
coming. I appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing how these programs come out in the future. Thanks again very much, Karrie and Dr. DeBarbieri.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.